Introduction, Lemma 1 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Craig Franklin. Social statics, or the conditions essential to human happiness, specified, and the first of them developed, by Herbert Spencer. It seems at first sight a very rational way of testing any proposed rule of conduct to ask, how will it work? Taking men as we know them, and institutions as they are, what will result from carrying such a theory into practice? This very common sense style of inquiry is that by which most opinions on morals and politics are formed. People consider of any system whether it seems feasible, whether it will square with this or the other social arrangement, whether it fits what they see of human nature. They've got certain notions of what man is and what society must be, and their verdict on any ethical doctrine depends upon its accordance or discordance with these. Such a mode of settling moral questions is clearly open to all the criticisms so fatal to the expediency philosophy. Incapacity for guiding ourselves in detail by making estimates of consequences implies incapacity for judging of first principles by that method. But passing over this, there is yet another reason for rejecting an inquiry so pursued as worthless, namely, that it assumes the character of mankind to be constant. If moral systems are adopted or condemned because of their consistency or inconsistency with what we know of men and things, then it is taken for granted that men and things will ever be as they are. It would be absurd to measure with a variable standard. If existing humanity is the gauge by which truth must be determined, then must that gauge, existing humanity, be fixed. Now that it is not fixed, might have been thought sufficiently obvious without any proving, so obvious indeed as to make proof look ridiculous. But unfortunately, those whose prejudice make them think otherwise are too numerous to be passed by. Their scepticism needs to be met by facts, and wearisome though it may be to the philosophic reader, there is no alternative but to go into these. And first, let us pause a moment to consider the antecedent improbability of this alleged constancy in human nature. It is a trite enough remark that change is the law of all things, true equally of a single object and of the universe. Nature, in its infinite complexity, is ever growing to a new development. Each successive result becomes the parent of an additional influence, destined in some degree to modify all future results. No fresh thread enters into the texture of that endless web woven in the roaring loom of time, but what more or less alters the pattern. It has been so from the beginning. As we turn over the leaves of the earth's primeval history, as we interpret the hieroglyphs in which are recorded the events of the unknown past, we find the same ever-beginning, never-ceasing change. We see it alike in the organic and the inorganic, in the decompositions and the recombinations of matter, and in the constantly varying forms of animal and vegetable life. Old formations are worn down, new ones are deposited, forests and bogs become coal basins, and the now igneous rock was once sedimentary. With an altering atmosphere and a decreasing temperature, land and sea perpetually bring forth fresh races of insects, plants, and animals. All things are metamorphosed, infusorial shells into chalk and flint, sand into stone, stone into gravel. Strata get contorted, seas fill up, lands are alternatively upheaved and sunk. Where once rolled a fathomless ocean, now tower the snow-covered peaks of a wide-spread, richly clothed country teeming with existence. And where a vast continent once stretched, there remain but a few lonely coral islets to mark the graves of its submerged mountains. Thus also is it with systems, as well as with worlds. Orbits vary in their forms, axes in their inclinations, suns in their brightness. Fixed only in name, the stars are incessantly changing their relationships to each other. New ones from time to time suddenly appear, increase and wane, while the members of each nebula, suns, planets, and their satellites, sweep forever onwards into unexplored infinity. Strange indeed would it be if, in the midst of this universal mutation, man alone were constant, unchangeable. But it is not so. He also obeys the law of indefinite variation. His circumstances are ever altering, and he is ever adapting himself to them. Between the naked houseless savage and the Shakespeare and Newtons of a civilized state lie unnumbered degrees of difference. The contrasts of races in form, colour and feature are not greater than the contrasts in their moral and intellectual qualities. That superiority of sight, which enables a Bushman to see further with the naked eye than a European with a telescope, is fully paralleled by the European's more perfect intellectual vision. The Kalmuk, in delicacy of smell, and the Red Indian in acuteness of hearing, do not excel the white man more than the white man excels them in moral susceptibility. Every age, every nation, every climate exhibits a modified form of humanity, and in all times and amongst all people, a greater or less amount of change is going on. There cannot indeed be a more astounding instance of the tenacity with which man will cling to an opinion in spite of an overwhelming mass of adverse evidence than is shown in this prevalent belief that human nature is uniform. One would have thought it impossible to use eyes or ears without learning that mankind, very indefinitely, in instincts, in morals, in opinions, in tastes, in rationality, in everything. Even a stroll through the nearest museum would show that some law of modification was at work. Mark the grotesque frescoes of the Egyptians, or the shadowless drawings of the Chinese. Does the contrast between these and the works of European artists indicate no difference in the perspective powers of the races? Compare the sculptures of Athens with those of Hindustan or Mexico. Is not a greater sense of beauty implied by the one than the other? But passing to the more significant facts supplied by historians and travellers, what are we to think on reading the Greeks and the Romans had a deity to sanction and patronise every conceivable iniquity? Or when we hear of Polynesian tribes who believe that their gods feed upon the souls of the departed? Surely the characters indicated by such conceptions of divinity differ somewhat from ours. Surely, too, we may claim some essential superiority over those Tartars who leave infirm parents to die in hunger in the desert, and over those Fiji Islanders, amongst whom members of the same family have to keep watch against each other's treachery. It is not the custom of an Englishman to dine like a Carib upon a roasted captive, or even as the Abyssinian on a quivering slice from the haunch of a live ox. Neither does he, like a Red Indian, delight in the writhing of a victim at the stake, nor like a Hindu, burn his wife that her spirit may haunt his enemy. What one respect is there in which it can be asserted that human nature is always the same? Is it rationality? Why, Anaxagoras had to fly his country for having blasphemously asserted that the sun was not the chariot of the deity Helios, whilst amongst ourselves a child often puzzles its seniors by the question, who made God? Is it justice? No. Badly as the moderns have treated slaves, they have never, like the Spartans, encouraged their young warriors to waylay and assassinate helots for practice. Is it in honesty? If so, how come we to read that piracy was the exercise, the trade, the glory, and the virtue of the Scandinavian youth, whilst among ourselves privateering, even in time of war, is disapproved? Is it in want of mercy? Not so. For much as Austrian butcheries have lately disgraced Europe, they have not paralleled the doings of Genghis Khan, who signalized his first victory by casting 70 prisoners into cauldrons of boiling water, or of Timur, who massacred 100,000 Indian prisoners and erected a pyramid of 90,000 human heads on the smoking ruins of Baghdad, or of Attila, who totally extirpated and erased 70 cities. Is it in vindictiveness? Why, no. For whilst we are told of the Begum Sumru that, having ordered one of her dancing girls to be bricked up in a vault, she had her bed placed over it, that she may listen to her victim's dying moans, we find our own queen requesting, much to her credit, that the man who fired at her should not be flogged. Where now is the sameness? It is not in actions as we see. It is then in manners and opinions? Certainly not. Society in our day would hardly receive a lady or gentleman known to have poisoned an enemy. In Italy, however, there was a time when disgrace did not attach to such. No family would now follow the example of Visconti and choose the viper for an armorial bearing. Nor could we, in the 19th century, find a match to that German captain of mercenaries who in silver letters labelled himself Duke Warner, Lord of the Great Company, the enemy of mercy, of pity, and of God. But why go abroad for illustrations of human variability? Have we not plenty at home? In those early days, when it was thought quite sufficient for noblemen to widen their horn and carry their hawk fair, and leave study and learning to the children of mean people, in those days when men secured themselves inside thick walls and behind deep moats, and when women wore daggers, character was not just what we now find it. Whilst all nominally held the creed professed by ourselves, the borderer was most zealous at his prayers when going on a foray. Saints' names were battle cries, bishops led on their retainers to fight, and the highest piety was in the slaying of Saracens. Must not our natures have changed somewhat when we translate this same religion into peace, into philanthropic effort of all kinds, into missionary enterprise, into advocacy of temperance, into inquiries about labour and the poor? Does the agitation for the abolition of death punishment indicate no revolution in man's feelings since the days when Cromwell's body was exhumed and his head stuck on Temple Bar? The days when criminals were drawn and quartered as well as hung? The days when there were murmurs because Stafford was suffered a death without seeing his bowels burnt before his face? The days when creaking gibbets were scattered over the country? The days when church doors were covered with the skins of men who had committed sacrilege? And when we read that Sir John Hawkins, in honour of his having been the first to commence the slave trade, received the addition to his coat of arms of a demi-more proper bound with a cord, does it not seem that the national character has improved between his times and ours, when out of sympathy for the negroes 300,000 persons pledged themselves to abstain from all West India produce? But really, it is absurd to argue the matter. The very assertors of this fixedness of human nature tacitly disown their own belief in it. They constantly stultify themselves by remarks on differences of national character, on peculiarities in their friends' dispositions, and on their own special tastes and feelings. Admissions thus accidentally made quite invalidate their dogma. Nay, not even these are needed. No comparison between the habits of separate races, between man as he is and as he was, between the tempers and talents of individuals are necessary for this. To the man of any insight, the mere fact that he himself changes with circumstances from day to day, and from year to year, in sentiments, capacities and desires, is sufficient to show that humanity is indefinitely variable. And if humanity is indefinitely variable, it cannot be used as a gauge for testing moral truth. When we see that institutions impracticable in one age have flourished in a subsequent one, and that what once were salutary laws and customs have become repugnant, we may shrewdly suspect that the like changes will take place in the future. The incongruity with the state of men and things which at present gives to certain proposed principles an appearance of impracticability may, in a coming age, no longer exist, and those principles that now seem so well adapted to our social condition may then no longer harmonise with it. Unless, therefore, we assume that human nature, although hitherto variable, will henceforth remain fixed, a somewhat unwarrantable assumption, we must not allow the disagreement between any system of ethics and the present state of mankind to be taken as evidence against that system. Nay, more, not only ought we to regard such disagreement when it appears with prejudice, but we ought to expect it and to consider it, if anything, rather an indication of truth than of error. It is preposterous to look for consistency between absolute moral truths and the defective characters and usages of our existing state. As already said, morality professes to be a code of rules proper for the guidance of humanity in its highest conceivable perfection. A universal obedience to its precepts implies an ideal society. How then can it be expected to harmonise with the ideas and actions and institutions of man as he now is? When we say that mankind are sinful, weak, frail, we simply mean that they do not habitually fulfil the appointed law. Imperfection is merely another word for disobedience, so that congruity between a true theory of duty and an untrue state of humanity is an impossibility, a contradiction in the nature of things. Whoever, by the way of recommending his scheme of ethics, sets forth its immediate and entire practicability, thereby inevitably proves its falsehood. Right principles of action become practicable only as man becomes perfect, or rather, to put the expression in proper sequence, man becomes perfect just in so far as he is able to obey them. A total disagreement may therefore be looked for between the doctrines promulgated in the following pages and the institutions amidst which we live. And the reader will be prepared to view such disagreement not only as consistent with their truth, but as adding to its probability. End of introduction, Lemma 1.